Hello and welcome. My name is Emily Cooper, and for my residency with the Regional Cultural Centre in Letterkenny, I've decided to do a series of these recorded conversations with people that I've been working with. The idea is to replicate the conversations that we have together with our colleagues and our peers after a literary event, and all the conversations that are flowing from the thoughts and ideas that happen. I'd love to introduce to you two tonight to James Conor Patterson, who is the editor of an upcoming anthology on the border, and Jess McKinney, who is a poet from Donegal. So here they are. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm just going to ask a few questions with James first. So,
Sure.
James, this anthology has come at a very pivotal time in the context of the North. What exactly did you want to achieve with the anthology? Like, what were your motivations with it?
Yeah, I guess it's sort of a weird happenstance that the anthology, it'll be coming out later this year in October, but that this year marks the centenary of partition. It's kind of, I think it's very sort of appropriate that it's lined up that way. But basically, my original kind of impetus for putting the anthology together was because it was motivated by a number of things, really. Sort of first and foremost was the idea that whenever Irish literature is talked about, and Northern literature in particular is talked about, the focus is almost always on, either Belfast or the very, very sort of rare occasion it'll be Derry. And I kind of wanted to explore what voices from other parts of the broad kind of Ulster into kind of Louth region we're doing, and I guess because of the Brexit discourse as well from the last sort of 5 years or so, and oddly, the border being talked about as kind of a bargaining chip without actually consulting or listening to voices of people from border areas. I felt that it was important, the combination of those two sort of factors. I felt it was important to sort of gather together what I saw as, the most exciting voices from the border regions to just give their take on their experiences, whether that's their experience with the border itself or their experience just of kind of life and writing and literature and their thoughts and that sort of thing in general. So it's kind of a mix of ideas in there. I suppose what I wanted to do in creating an anthology which was based around the border was to open it out a little bit more and take it away from the kind of old binary idea of the border, although that is very much at the center of North, South, Irish, British, Catholic, Protestant, that whole thing. It's recognizing that Ireland is a much more plural place than it was a century ago. Identities are much more complex now than they've ever been before. And I wanted to explore that and get people's kind of individual experiences, because I think by collecting those and kind of putting them together in one place, we can have a more plural idea of what the border actually means.
That's really interesting, because I can see like there's a lot more diversity in experiences than you would expect in the North. Was there anything you noticed when you were collecting it together that was like an unexpected commonality that was in the writing?
I think one thing oddly that's come across from all of it is a deep sort of connection with landscape. I hesitate to use terms like psychogeography because there's a kind of weightedness behind that, and there are certain connotations to that. But I think it's appropriate in this case because the kind of psychic weight of growing up in a liminal area where identity is fluid by its very sort of nature.
My dog.
I think she's interested in having the chats too. But yeah, I think just growing up sort of along those sort of liminal landscapes and whatever else has connected, for better or worse, not only the people but the representatives of those places very, very deeply to the landscape, whether that's kind of a more urbanized landscape like Derry, or the rural landscapes along the border as well. There's a rootedness to the land, and like an interest in the land, even sort of writing in the anthology, which is personal and sort of to do with the body or sexuality or whatever else. There's still that sort of connection, oddly, to the land, and sort of talking about those experiences through wider vistas like landscape. So yeah, I think that's one of the sort of common themes which has come across. Kind of like almost like eco writing in a way, but maybe not as straightforward as that. More multifaceted, I think.
I think that is like I definitely thought about that when I was writing my piece, because I thought about it directly as, so living in Derry, I'm sort of exposed to a lot of like almost harshness, and then to see Donegal across the border, or like where I was from was like on the border, it always felt like something very peaceful and like a respite. And it's kind of strange to consider like a place that's so close as being like in such direct contrast. I guess that must have come up a lot with like a lot of people, because like if you're on the border, like the perception is that on one side you had like chaos, and the other side you had relative peace. I think it's much more complicated than that though as well.
I think like one of the other things that's sort of come across is that respite is definitely there as a theme, but there's like a cheeky sort of subversiveness as well. Like I'm even thinking of, like it's one of the kind of cliches about the border, but like you take a topic like smuggling or whatever, it's always kind of talked about with like a wink and a nod sort of thing. But even right down to very sort of day-to-day experiences, like crossing from Derry into Donegal to go for an ice cream or a pint, or and the way that the chocolate tastes different, and the potato bags are different when you go into the shop and all that kind of thing. There's an odd sense of like subversiveness that you're kind of bunking off school nearly, which again, that sort of cheekiness comes across in the writing as well. So there's a lot of things going on there, I think.
What about for you, Jess? Because you grew up on the Donegal side, so I guess you would have had a different perspective, sort of looking in the other direction.
Yeah, very much so. I was kind of thinking about this earlier, that maybe from a very sort of childish point of view, that I was looking out and orientating myself from the point of view of the smaller area of like Inishowen, which geographically doesn't really make any sense, because obviously you would orientate yourself via the larger spaces like on the map and like the cities and stuff. So yeah, it very much did feel like that. I always felt a bit like it was a sort of invisible line in the road that you would go over all the time, and it was always sort of gestured to, but never really, in my experience anyway, kind of like verbalized. And it was all these sorts of like little signifiers, I suppose, kind of what you're talking about with the crisp packets. And I always got caught up with the money changing over. Like it was always such a thing of going onto the bus, you could pay with either euro or sterling, and I always really enjoyed that. And I think that's something I've kind of carried with me, that in telling people that whenever it happens to come up, that they find it very, very strange not being from a border area. and then that sort of like I don't know, the moment of going into Derry for a day, and the first thing you have to do is change your money over, and just how normal that was, and how kind of that was like part of the journey and part of the experience. I always felt that there was no real kind of like sensical difference that I could see between the different areas. And I always felt it was more just kind of like whenever we would go over the line in the road, as I always kind of thought about it, my dad would kind of say something about like some sort of historical tidbit, and I would kind of think about it more so in the real earthy sense of kind of like all the memory that was kind of carried in the land and kind of buried in that place. But then kind of once you'd gone over it, it was gone, sort of in that way. And maybe that was just from being young and being surrounded by people who maybe didn't talk about it so much, that a lot of the differences maybe were very non-verbal in my experience. Yeah.
I think that's something like the sort of reality and unreality of the border is something that's very interesting, because like growing up right beside it, like the border is not that interesting on a day-to-day basis. It's only
No.
whenever you apply other things onto it. But I think like growing up, we did like try to like categorize people from the north and south in like strange ways, like with the crisp packets and everything, but you do it with people. Like I always felt a bit strange because I was like a little bit from both, and I could never really, I was always trying to work out which aspects of myself were northern and what was like Donegal, which is a very strange compulsion to do, and I don't know if people do it in other places. What about growing up in Newry is like a completely different experience, but so similar.
Yeah.
Because you're so close to Dublin as well. It's like you're close to you're as how far away? Like you're as close to Belfast as you are to Dublin. Basically, you're sort of somewhere
Yeah,
in the middle.
roughly about halfway. It would be you'd be slightly closer to Belfast, I think. But you know, on the whole, if you're traveling by car, you're talking maybe an hour to Belfast and an hour and 15 minutes to Dublin or something. Like it's negligible, really, the difference. But yeah, that sense of like, it's strange. I think growing up in Newry, when from a psychological point of view, we would have always, even though we were sort of consciously part of the North, um, we would have always looked south. And what I mean by that is like, whenever it was talk, you know, whenever there was talk about going for a day out in the city, say, it was always understood that that would have been Dublin, even though it's further away. Or, you know, if we were talking about like the next town over, it would have always been Dundalk. Even though if you go north of Newry, you've got Banbridge, which is roughly about the same distance away. So like Dundalk was always sort of, in my mind anyway, it was always like, you know, the next big sort of settlement or town. I think it's interesting as well. You kind of bring up, you know, trying to spot the differences between people from different places. And I always would have had that sense, but it was never really. You would have, yeah, you would have had maybe, you know, on shopping days or whatever, you could spot like the southern registrations sort of coming up to do their shopping and take advantage of the exchange rate and things like that. But in terms of like spotting differences between people, I always kind of thought that it was no more pronounced than like, you know, kind of, you know, when you take like the football, like inter-county rivalry, like when Down were playing Armagh, or and maybe that was just because in the school that I went to, you know, it was kind of split fairly evenly between Down and Armagh supporters, and you would try and sort of work out like, you know, who was better at football, what the reasons for that were, and did it come from the fact that they were, you know, maybe from a more rural background or whatever it was. So yeah, it's strange the things that you think back on now.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because it's like a normal thing that you'll have like a rival town, or rival county, but whenever it's over the border, it sort of takes on this more like global like importance, which is
Yeah.
strange. Like it's not like I wouldn't say that the people are really that much different, but it's just that it's applied in this like really abstract way.
Yeah.
How I would want to ask both of you how the border has affected your writing. Like I think we've discussed this before, James, like how because you lived in England when you were very small and you were born over there, like how that
Yeah.
change affected your idea of yourself and your language. Like how do
Yeah.
you think that the border has impacted long term on your writing?
Oh, big. I think big time, and I think it sort of seeped in maybe subconsciously from an early age. And I think what Jess was saying about, never verbalizing what it was, but you were always aware that it was there. Like it was this subconscious kind of idea that there was something different about growing up, not just in the border areas, but like in the north of Ireland in general, compared to anywhere else. And those differences kind of became pronounced for me from a pretty early age. Like I was born in Coventry. My dad then got a job in Aberdeen, like very sort of northern part of Scotland, and I lived there until I was about 6, and then we came back to Newry in about 95, just after about a year after the ceasefire. And like my parents will tell me that like when we came back, I spoke with a Scottish accent, like fully. Like I'd been to nursery and I had been socialized with all my friends, where my little kind of next door neighbor friends and stuff were in Scotland and all that kind of thing. And when I started primary school, I still had that kind of accent. But yeah, there were little cues all the time that, you were kind of landing in somewhere completely different. Like, from what I remember of Aberdeen and sort of growing up there, it was just a very sort of normal, boring, like suburban existence. Nice, sort of domestic, lower middle class life, right? But coming back to Northern Ireland, then we're staying in my granny's house for the first year after we come back, and there's soldiers outside, and there's helicopters every night, and it's just like a completely new world. And I have a very vivid memory actually of, I think it was Euro '96, or the qualifiers for it, and Scotland were playing England. And I remember being sort of gauche and young and sort of saying, oh, well, I was born in England, so I should support England. And like everyone in the room, like my granddads, my parents, they were all like, absolutely not. We're supporting Scotland in this. And that still sticks in my mind, even though I was only very, very young. So yeah, those differences sort of existed from a very early age. And that does affect your writing, because it affects your personality. And, as much as we might like to get away from it, your personality ultimately is your writing. I think, no matter how abstract you might want to make it or whatever else, the choices that you make that feed into your writing are still reflective of who you are. And because of all those experiences, I would be a completely different writer had I stayed in England or stayed in Scotland from a young age.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Like as a child, I lived in England and London, and we moved over here, and I think that change has like really impacted my life, because I think maybe there's something to be said about like not necessarily being born into that situation of like coming into the troubles, but maybe coming at it at a slightly older age where it's something that you actively are taught about or learn about in a way that feels, I think it must feel very different to someone who had lived in Newry or in Derry their whole life.
Yeah.
Jess, you're a bit younger than us, so I think probably you had a very different experience of I've grown up like in and around or near the north.
Yeah, it was funny in the way that my first ever real proper tangible memory of noticing of conceiving of this idea that there is a difference between the two spaces that lie across this divide in the road was actually around foot and mouth.
Yeah.
And I was really young, but I remember it really, really, really clearly being stopped and searched for sausages and cheese and things like that. And for some reason, that really stuck in my mind of like, maybe it was just the actual sense of taking an item from one place to another, that there was a difference. There was a reason I couldn't have this cheese at home. And, there's so many people traveling over the border to go to their preferred butchers and all that sort of thing. And I, for some reason, that really hit home with me for that first time in which I really became aware of it. Because, yeah, I just think maybe around Inishowen, like the border is just so quiet, and it had been so quiet for so much of my experience. And like, it was similar to kind of what James was saying about like going for the day out in the city, like that would be Derry. And like, I always looked at it as kind of this like this symbol, this like of the wider world, and kind of like that stepping stone, because it had things like this big library and like art galleries and shops and cinemas, and like it just seemed so futuristic sometimes to me. And so I was really caught up in that it was kind of this like symbol of like differences in like what else the world had to offer, I guess. But and that it was you had to go to Derry to go to Dublin. That I was very, very aware of that as a child. So I kind of thought that it was almost kind of like, I suppose because Inishowen is in a sort of like basin, especially when you're looking out of the body of water of the Lake of Shadows, it feels very enclosed. And it almost kind of felt like going through Derry was the passage to like this wider experience and people and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it was very different, I suppose, because it was also quite sheltered in a lot of ways. And that I would have spent time over and back the border. I never really thought anything of it, but I suppose I was always kind of very sheltered by it. Of, the people who were from Derry went to school in Derry, and like as I got older, I would have had more friends up there, but they always seemed just so much cooler, and that was probably the stock I had in it.
There is a vibe in Derry though, definitely. Like I always noticed this growing up, like because my family's from Donegal. Derry is so trendy. Like
yeah, they had Sandinos and what the equivalent of the Bankies, the cool goth kids who hung out outside the library.
Yeah.
And
Sandinos
like a record shop. Yeah.
I think it's like this Derry's history though, the like shirt factories, and also because it's a matriarchal city, like historically, because the women would have worked in the shirt factories. So they were the ones that had money. So Derry has historically, so the disposable income was in the hands of the women, and the men often didn't work or did work that wasn't as well paid as the women. So the disposable income was spent on like clothes and hair and stuff like that. So Derry has this like really long history of like being very fashionable. And as like Donegal people, because I was brought up by a Donegal mother, we didn't have that. Like we didn't have that sense of like fashion that people in Derry always did. So it was always like a bit always felt like a bit old fashioned in our clothes compared to like Derry people, which is kind of weird.
Yeah, it did really feel like stepping into the future. Like it does really feel like you went forward in time. And it's funny that you should mention about the factory, because I did think that was a real point of like kinship between Buncrana specifically and Derry, because that was the site of the Fruit of the Loom factories so long ago, and that it was as much as it is like that coastal town, like so much of its identity in the past had been tied up in it being a factory town. And whenever Fruit of the Loom left, like it was kind of devastating. And I always felt like that was something that really kind of unified Derry and Buncrana, and maybe made the differences less, because there was that sense of that working sphere in common, and that sense of like, I don't know, that aspect of identity, I guess. But that would have been before my time, but it was really something that kind of felt heavy in the town and was always kind of in the air, especially because the ghosts of the factories are still there, immaculately preserved, and they're never really going to be shifted. So that was always kind of looming.
You mentioned the factories, because like my family's from 𝗥𝗂𝗏, and I remember a time before the factories. The factories were built when I was very small, and like, you know, the one down the back road, I remember that was like fields, and it's kind of the history of 𝗥𝗂𝗏 is this like factory town is actually really short-lived, and before that it had like a really beautiful shorefront and everything. It was a holiday town for dairy people, or like people.
Yeah, for swing dancing as well. It was a really big swing dancing spot.
What's that about what do you call the dance hall in 𝗥𝗂𝗏 that it burnt down?
The begins with an R. I'm gonna be.
Oh, I'm so bad at memory, but I always wanted to go in there, and you know, it's one of those places you walk past, you're like, oh, I'll go in there someday, and it had like a sprung floor. And
it did. We used to go for it's called the Plaza. I can't believe I couldn't remember that. I've spent so many evenings of my life in there, and it was where there used to be the Battle of the Bands and that sort of thing when I was a teenager. But it had springboard floors, and it had a very mysterious fire, which actually turned out to be an electrical fault. But it was perfectly kind of preserved with like all these beautiful luminous pictures of like dances back in the day. And there were so many hotels on the coast as well that would like look out over the water, and people would travel so far to go dance in the springboard floors. And yes, apparently swing was really, really big up and down the coast.
There's really good videos online of 𝗥𝗂𝗏. I think it was the Fla in like the 70s on YouTube. It just looked like loads of hippies and stuff. James, I wanted to ask you about, I've been reading your work voraciously of late, and I've noticed a lot of your work is written in this kind of vernacular style. I wanted to ask you about like what is your intention with that? Like, is it like a democratizing kind of impulse, or is there something else going on there?
Yeah, very much so. I think I've come to it kind of very late on, and I don't really know what the first impulse for it was, but I do know that, you know, it's tied up in thinking about how speech, particularly in the north of Ireland, is a marker for identity on like a number of different levels. So I'll give you an example of even just on a day-to-day basis how it can like affect the way we speak and the words that we use. I remember during the Euro 2016 competition, Northern Ireland and the Republic were both playing in the same competition, and it just so happened that one of the days they were both playing on the same night but in different games. And I remember getting a taxi in Belfast and getting into the taxi, and my impulse with taxi drivers is, you know, I always, you know, bring up football as like a kind of point of chat or whatever. And the first thing I would normally say is like, oh, you know, if it was, because I was always brought up to support the Republic, oddly, just because, you know, being from a sort of nationalist / Republican family or whatever, that was just a given. And I was this close to going, how do you think we'll do tonight, right? But who was we, right? Was we Northern Ireland in that game, or was we the Republic in the other game? And the whole conversation was contingent on who the taxi driver was, right? So I had to think very carefully about how to word that question, right? So it was, how do you think the Republic will do tonight, or how do you think the North will do tonight? And so I think from maybe that point on, that kind of got me thinking about how language in the North in particular is so politicized on like a day-to-day basis, and that vernacular can be used not only in that kind of, quasi sectarian sort of way, but also, that vernacular in particular and regional dialect is a marker of place and class, sometimes of gender, sometimes of race, and that in fact there's this whole rich sort of world that can be opened up just by writing in your own voice, literally in your own voice, whether that's conveyed on the page like sort of phonetically, like Irvine Welsh does in Train Spotting, or whether that's a more formalized mode of speaking, and we can kind of get into the ins and outs of it. But if we take Ulster Scots as an example, where there's like a formal sort of set of rules around different words and where they come from and so on, vernacular opens up this whole space away from received pronunciation, and I think can make poetry all the richer if and when people do experiment with it, and you notice it in American poetry a lot at the moment. Like I'm thinking of somebody like Daniel Smith, for example, and their last book, 𝗥𝗖𝗖 𝗩𝗶𝗿𝘁𝘂, they write in this kind of stylized Minnesotan urban dialect, which is very specific to the area of St. Paul where Dana Smith grew up, and that they're writing first and foremost for people in their community. That in itself was a completely political act, and so I think I kind of, from reading things like that and kind of exploring things like that, I've definitely internalized that over the last couple of years.
It is quite interesting as well that it seems like there are new audiences for that kind of work as well, that although we might, when we're using vernacular, be writing to our own community, it's sort of a way of bringing that community and its ideology outward. So I think it is quite interesting as well when you're getting things published in literary magazines in England and places like that, where previously that kind of mode of speaking probably wouldn't have been published.
I think as well,
you have
it's like
Heaney as well, though. I suppose like Heaney was doing that, but he was doing it within I guess within like a very approaching more academic mode within a structure that was like fitting where he had a foot in each camp. So I think
and I think he had to kind of, the vernacular was sort of around the edges of Heaney's work, but I think you're right in the sense that it had to be more academic, because I think he maybe had a sense that as a Northern Catholic writer in the 1960s or the 1970s, that he had to write in this almost heightened way in order to be taken seriously. Because if he was just to go in with this kind of, guttural, very local way of speaking, he may not have had the career that he had. In a certain sense, it sounds like a cliche, of course, but like, people like that did pave the way for a generation now to be able to write confidently and say, well, fuck received pronunciation or form or whatever it is. I'm going to do completely my own thing, and you either like it or you don't. It still feels like a compromise in a way, and what I mean by that is, it's obviously the language that I've grown up speaking, but I always have huge admiration for people like Doran na Gríofa, for example, who has published entire collections as 𝗥𝗖𝗖 𝗩𝗶𝗿𝘁𝘂. I don't have that capacity because I haven't spoken Irish since I was 16. I haven't I haven't kept it on, or I haven't kept on the fluency to the extent that I would feel confident doing that. But that I think again is an inherently political act, you know, to write in a native language or a language that was, you know, at threat of dying for many centuries, to kind of reclaim that and commit to paper a whole book that then goes on to be critically well received or whatever. You know, that is massively radical. And I think, you know, people like Doran na Gréfa and previous generations of, you know, Nuala ní Donal, people like that, like they deserve so much credit for sticking to their guns.
I think it's like, it is something that's very difficult as a writer, as a writer speaking a language that's not necessarily your native tongue, and also not having the fluency to be able to read or write in that language. I actually was talking to Supriya in one of the other conversations about this, because English is her third language. And I think it is quite interesting. Like, it is really wonderful that in some ways it's brutal, but it's good that we have like a common tongue that we can communicate across the board. But it's also a very strange feeling to be a writer in Ireland and being detached from Irish. Jess, do you how do you feel about the language question?
I've been thinking about this a lot recently, as I suppose we have all been reading so much of Doran's wonderful work recently. I think it is really, her work is doing a wonderful job of bringing that to the fore, along with books like people like Magg as well, and 32 Words for Field, and kind of, I'm really sort of interested in the etymological aspect of it, and I've been trying to, I feel like I have no hope of fluency, but I'm interested in understanding the root of certain words, because there is such musicality and deep connection and influence of landscape and environment in the Irish language, which I'm terrifically interested in. I listened to a talk recently between himself and Anne-Marie Kieran, and they were talking about that kind of as far back as kind of very, very old runes, and how they were kind of influenced by different varieties of trees, and that there are so many different terms for a hole in the ground dependent by what animal made it or what natural force made it. And I'm really terrifically interested in that, mostly probably in a botanical sense for myself, but yeah, I feel like that's a small way that I can reclaim. And I feel bad that I don't have the fluency, and I suppose specifically in being from Donegal, because there's these wonderful pockets of Irish speaking areas, and I wish that I was from one of those, but I'm not. So I suppose I'm just trying to learn little bits and try and bring them back into the everyday vernacular. But yeah, I totally kind of agree with what James was saying. It's interesting how each person kind of perceives it. But yeah, I do definitely think that I would love to see in my lifetime a reformation in the way that it's negotiated in school. I think that would be so wonderful, because I think that it is truly a rebellious, wonderful thing, full of energy, and the way that we're kind of brought to it at school, it seems quite like, I don't know, tired, and that's not really the reality of it at all. So I would love to see that in the coming years, I guess. That would be my true wish.
I definitely agree with that. I do think that it's very difficult to approach a language from like in a school way, whenever what you really want to do is create like a living language, and it's not a living language when you're learning it in that way. And I think what you're saying about like the sources of all the meanings is really, like, it's very important whenever you consider the loss of the language isn't just the loss of this like literal like system of of words. It is, you're losing the ideology, and you're losing so many different things behind it about the landscape and the nature of the people here and our history. I think it is a really sad thing that we can relearn the language, but you're not necessarily going to gain that back. I think a lot of the time about I'm a bit obsessed with the thought the thought problem. It's called the ship of Theseus, and so this is like a constant. I'm always coming back to this. So it's like the ship that Theseus brought from Crete over a number of years was like replaced piece by piece. Like the wood was replaced, like the floorboards, the oars, everything was replaced over time. And like whether that is the same ship at the end at this point in time as it was at the beginning, and that's what
like the 𝗥𝗖𝗑𝗏𝗂𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏
you can apply that to the Irish language, where you can replace and relearn X amount of times, but like at what point is it a completely different language in its source and its understanding than it is today from then? And it's something I want to know more about it, and I want to speak better Irish, but I am very bad. But I think it is quite interesting that the three of us have been thinking about this recently, and I think that it probably is to do with like a cultural shift that's happening in Ireland at the minute. I think there was it seemed like there's a general feeling that Irish for a long time, because of the school system and because it was regimented, has sort of had a negative feeling for a lot of people. But I think it might be changing, but like
I think
we can't tell.
What reinvigorated it for me, I did it up until GCSE in school, and I went to the 𝗥𝗖𝗖 in 𝗏𝗏 when I was about 15, and I enjoyed Irish, when I was in school and stuff, but I kind of let it fall by the wayside for years. But what got me kind of thinking about it again, and I think his sort of credit is, it can't be overstated really. When I think about learning with Kieran Carson in Belfast, and Kieran, as you know, came from a bilingual background. He grew up speaking Irish and English. I think they actually spoke Irish as their first language in the house. He was from that like really old school 1940s, 1950s generation in the Falls. But he was obsessed with ideas of cross-pollination between Irish and English and vice versa. And he would use sort of examples of that, like, if you think of the English expression, you ask somebody in Manchester how it's going, and they'll say it's smashing. Apparently that comes from is moi sin, it's good, right? Or I mean, there's loads of different examples.
Some apocryphal ones like and dig into, or are you digging it? I think
yeah.
I remember being told when I was a child that when someone like boos at a football team, it was like a mistake because the English were playing the Irish in a football game or something, and the Irish were all shouting "There a boo" or like whatever, some kind of local team a boo, and then they're like,
yeah,
they're booing us, and that's where boo comes from. I quite like those like apocryphal ones are kind of as enjoyable as the real ones.
Oh, definitely, and like I'll tell you a funny story actually about Kieran. I'm thinking if I should actually, because it's a bit rude. No, look, I'll save it for another time, but it is very funny, and it's about that. It's about that that idea of cross-pollination. But we could talk all day as well about place names and like how that's been affected by this kind of half world between English and Irish, and I think vernacular definitely, in some places more than others, falls into that mode. Hiberno English is its own category entirely.
There was a great there was a great essay in the Sting and Fly I think it might have been the Galway issue, about vernacular that was really, really enjoyable. I would definitely recommend it. I wanted to ask you, Jess, about landscape again. We're coming back sort of around to the same topics. I really like the way you mentioned from where you're from, you're like looking out west. I like that idea of the west of Ireland as, of course, you're like looking into the Swilly, but like beyond that is the Atlantic. And I think that really has affected like my idea of place, from being able to stand on the edge of Europe and like look out at the rest of the world. Or like, it's not, you're not looking out the rest of the world, it's like you're looking out at just an expanse of nothing, of the sea. And I wanted to ask, like, how does that landscape and the sort of endlessness of it affect your writing?
That's very kind of interesting. Yeah, I've thought about that, like that very specific body of water, kind of looking out at it quite a lot. I suppose it's really, really kind of sunk in over the years in little bits and pieces subconsciously. Mostly, I think, because of the naming aspect of it, in that it's referred to quite a lot as the Lake of Shadows, which I'm sure you know already.
The Lake
but
of
how that's the
creepy.
Yeah, the Lake of Eyes as well, and it's all kind of tied to the ferociousness of the currents, and how that looks from afar, and it creates this kind of like shadowy dapple effect. And I've kind of thought about that a lot over the years, and how kind of like naming is related to kind of like the visual aspect and the sensory aspects. But yeah, that sort of endlessness, I've also been thinking about that, and that I was talking to my dad about this conversation earlier, and he was talking so much about how 𝗥𝗖𝗖 is the hinterland of Derry, and it's only 13 miles down the road and all this sort of thing. And I was like looking up the definition of hinterland, just to kind of think of it, and I came across this one, and it's hinterland is an area lying beyond what is visible or known. And it's funny because that was everything that was visible and known to me, and everything beyond that was hinterland, I guess. Yeah, I think it's kind of informed my writing in the way that, like, I've had the same kind of conversation with a lot of northern writers, or writers from the north, in that they tried to kind of get away from the area that they were from, and that when I moved away when I was younger, I kind of was always, I never really felt that it was so much part of my writing identity, and then through writing kind of circled back around to it in that way, and that I felt like the world was so vast and there was so much to write about, and that the way you kind of dismiss sometimes your roots whenever you're younger, not dismiss, but there seems so much more out there that you've yet to learn, and then through your writing you sort of circle back around that it, despite the vastness of everything, you're pulled back to the same area. So I suppose that's the sort of the way that I've been thinking about it, that no matter what, I've still kind of been pulled back to the same shore.
I definitely experienced the same thing. Like, it is quite interesting the way I've never really thought about it, about the vastness of everything else, and like circling back into what you know is quite interesting. Like, I find it like you do just it's like sometimes I think about things like, have you seen, or what is it, like this the Revenants? It's like a French TV show about like dead people that keep on being born again, but there's like a bit classic where like they go out, try to go outside the town, and then they're just like back in there. Writing, like, it does that to you, where you're like on your way out, you're like on your way out away from yourself, and then suddenly you're right back straight where you began.
Yeah, I really felt that, like, going to Queen's and doing the MA there was like a steady acceptance of that, and that I was finally ready to like approach that. As it felt just so massive to try and even begin to negotiate in writing, and I felt that like going there and joining in and looping back in with conversations about kind of the area and that sort of thing, and that it, and how it influenced all the conversations and the other people that I'd be working with, it really felt like a kind of a reclamation in that way. But yeah, in the beginning it just did feel kind of too massive, and I didn't really know how it would ever work. But then you kind of end up doing it anyway. You're sort of bound to it in that way.
I think like sometimes it feels like like you struggle to find the ideal subject to talk about, and there's like a lot of things that I would like want to write about, but sometimes it's just like it's not for you, like, and sometimes you come back and you can't, I don't know, it's about, I guess it's about depth. Like you can find depth within your own sphere easier than you can somewhere else. You need that. It's interesting that the three of us all went to Queen's at some stage. James, you went to Queen's, didn't you? Yeah.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
I think like it has definitely got like a very specific place within Ireland, the Seamus Heaney Centre, and I'm quite interested to know, like, as like postgraduates now, where we've all left university and that kind of academic sphere, like coming back to like Seamus Heaney and talking about how he sort of was writing from the academy to a certain extent, with the vernacular and with the rural kind of approach or subject matter. I'm kind of interested to know, like, what does the poet mean outside of the academy? James, what do you think about that?
It's a strange one, isn't it? I think on the one hand, like, there's a lot of, particularly in recent years, there's been a bit of a backlash, I think, against creative writing courses in particular, where people, you know, it's kind of talked about in this sort of way that, like, you know, oh, everyone's doing it, so therefore it must have no value. But you know, that's of course, like, I think that's nonsense. To be honest, I think it depends on who's teaching you. I think as well, a little bit of it actually comes from the idea that, like, you know, creative writing courses are without value. Is kind of born out of the idea that some writers have that, you know, to be a writer or to be an artist is somehow special, and that you're, you know, from this very sort of elevated position. And I've always thought, I still think that, you know, writing in particular and writing well, it doesn't matter who you are, because everyone has a story. I think it can be taught, and I think it can be taught to everyone. I think that you can get everyone to a certain pitch where they tell their story clearly, and that every story has a kind of value to it. On whether the academy is the best place for that is a different story again. I think, you know, as I said, I think that's to do with who your teacher is. I think it comes down to that. And I think the reason that the Heaney Centre has been such a centre of gravity for, you know, a whole generation really of writers from north and south. I've known people from as far away as, like, you know, Cork, Mayo, and they all ended up doing their MA up in Belfast. And the reason that they did that is because the Heaney Centre offered the best creative writing MA on the island, if not across Ireland and Britain.
Is it only poetry MAs? Because I think,
yeah,
maybe that's part of it as well, that it's so specifically poetry. I can't think of another place.
I did the prose MA, which is really, yeah. It was strange. It was the first year that so poetry, before I started it, creative poetry used to be part of the overall creative writing masters, and then it was split off into poetry MA, became its own thing, where you could either pursue the critical route or the creative route within poetry. So the year I did it, I thought I was applying for creative poetry, and I ended up doing prose. But I actually think that's actually helped my writing in a lot of ways. You know, given it kind of narrative structure and so on. And I think, you know, the boundaries between prose and poetry sometimes are pretty thin anyway. So no, I think it was a completely invaluable experience, and I would recommend it to anyone that thinks that they're ready, or that, you know, they want to pursue writing as a career. If they're thinking about taking that next step, absolutely to do that.
Yeah, I think like, it is interesting that you say that you can teach creative writing. Like, you can definitely teach someone what not to do. I think that learning to write is like a series of realizing what not to do, and it's not always obvious at the start. You sort of have to like learn, and it accumulates over time. Jess, you were before you did your MA, you had the Not For You collective, which is, I guess, something like very DIY outside of that kind of sphere, where you were basically, well, you can explain it to me better. Like, I want to know about what you were doing with that, and how you think that has like influenced your career as a writer.
Yeah, it was definitely born of a very DIY sort of space in the really heady days of being a young writer, and kind of getting to grips that that's what you want to pursue, and banding together with people. It was the first ever real time, I guess, that I'd really banded together with other poets, and we felt that we could create something together, and and kind of creating that sense of community. It's again what drew me to the MA as well, and it was sort of in a lot of ways my first ever real experience of that, because being in Dublin and my sort of experience to writing largely up until then was I used to just go to so many open mics, and there was a big spoken word poetry scene, and I knew that although I enjoyed listening to so much of that, that wasn't what I wanted to do, and that wasn't what I was writing. And I found a few other people who kind of were writing similar things, and we were kind of more interested in like quieter readings and like workshops, and kind of taking part in like events and talks, and and it kind of came together in that very sort of DIY way, and very sort of collaborative. It was very collaborative at its base, and in a time where I wasn't really able to access like further education of like the MA, because I had to save for a long time to do that, and was working, it was really a saving grace for me, because it really gave some structure to my writing. And I suppose when you're working with other people, it helps to keep you accountable, especially when you're starting off, that somebody knows what you're working on, and you have this trusted sense of your friends that you could share your work. And it was really terrific for all those things, and for meeting other creative people and trying to create spaces for other people to come and do just even a workshop on a Sunday where you all make little zines together. And it was really lovely in that way, that I'd never felt that I was able to do anything like that before. And then through coming together with other writers, it was a really terrific experience, because I felt like I could for the first time in my life, and that was kind of amazing. And I don't know if I would have gotten there on my own so quickly. It would have taken a lot longer. And I suppose working with people like that, and through meeting people like that and having those conversations, it sort of emboldened me. And it was a real sort of education, like the pub chats after literary events, getting all these recommendations of reading. And it had been years since I'd done my BA, and I had just missed so much of that. And it really sort of fed the hunger to kind of continue down the line of pursuing poetry more seriously. But yeah, so that's kind of was my experience of it. And it really developed outside that world of developed outside of academia, because for a long time I wasn't really sure, and the people that I was working with, whether that was the best space for creativity. And then as you sort of kind of move along and everybody develops at their own speeds and pursues their different projects, it turned out that was the space for me. But I still think that some of the best things that you can access through those academic spheres is the conversations. And as James was saying, through the people that are teaching you, the candid conversations are what are the most valuable, I think, sometimes, not even the classes. It's like the very, very candid advice that you're getting, conversations over coffee and like the office hours. Like that's the real bread and butter, I think. And that in working on that kind of collective project with other poets and friends, that was a kind of a first taste of that. And since they were really kind of helping me get to that space, I wanted to try and help some other people do some other things too.
I think that collaborative aspect of being a writer is really wonderful. I think it like is almost unexpected. I think there's an idea of a writer as someone that like sits alone at home and like taps on their typewriter. But the collective and collaborative projects I've done have always been the most exciting things. Like, and that feeling of being part of something larger than just your own work, and it's like a squeezing through. Like you keep each other good in a way because everything is interacting with each other. And no, I think that the idea of like the academy and then the outside of the academy being something that's for us is quite interesting. That the conversations that you have within the academy and outside are beneficial to the ecology of the writing and the art that's made. I think we may have come towards the end of our hour, or we might have even gone over the hour. But I would like to just end on a couple of poems. So would you like to go first, James? And then I will switch you on to Jess.
Sure.
I want to just say thank you very much to both of you for coming in and for staying at home and talking to me. To the RC.
No, honestly, it was a pleasure.
So James is going to read a poem, and then Jess. So I'll pin your paper. Here we go.
Okay. So the poem I've chosen to read actually is it's one of the vernacular poems that we've been talking about. And I suppose part of what I've been trying to do with the vernacular poems and tying that into writing about where I come from and writing about Newry is to move the border and border areas away from cliche kind of ideas and to kind of re-weird it in a way, because I think it's not talked about enough, but like, you know, border towns and border areas are extremely weird places, which are filled with like eccentrics, not least, you know, you'll always have like your local kind of medium or someone who can read tea leaves or someone who can, you know, someone who was the seventh son of the seventh son and has the gift of whatever. So I was kind of inspired by that idea for this poem. It doesn't have a title yet, but it kind of ties in with the idea of people who claim to have that gift. And I was reading about you know, the spiritualism movement in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and how mediums used to fake a lot of their seances and stuff and make them as spectacular as possible for like often a paying audience. So this doesn't have a title yet, but I'll read it for you anyway. Greedy for my own derangement, I pulled a 6-foot swatch of cheesecloth from my gullet like a never-ending hanky, passed it around the good room, proclaiming magic, then spoke of how it was this resurrected thing. Next, I tugged on a hidden catgut string so that the light disappeared, and in the fuss that followed, a man outlined in phosphorus steered into view and moved again the gloom. Meanwhile, a reaching rod thrust about the room, and all around me was chaos. Chaos. I fucking loved it when my house was in seance. Well, yeah, that's that one. It might still need like maybe a little bit of tinkering around, but yeah, that's sort of where I am with it. A little bit of weirdness.
We all love a bit of weirdness. Okay, and to end the session, we're gonna have Jess.
Thanks so much, Emily and James. That was so wonderful. I laughed a big laugh, and that's a great thing to have in a poem. I thought I'd read one of the slim little shorter prose poems from the anthology, and one that I keep coming back to because I was sort of very inspired by this quote from Anne-Marie Nicurin. At first I knew nothing of the border or that I was being divided, and I felt a lot of kinship and familiarity in that, in reading that. And I suppose this poem was quite a lot about that process of becoming aware of the different signifiers of your sort of identity and how they can kind of weigh you down, kind of longing for that sort of maybe blissful ignorance. It's called 𝗥𝗖𝗖 𝗩𝗶𝗿𝘁𝘂. We were taking on water when I woke, sinking into the still lake made strange for all its seawater without a source. The anchor already over, so I kept searching for something else to lose, some divine logic to pull it all together. Next went the compass, then the sails, crates and barrels, foghorn and paddles, the rudder, tackle and bait, lobster pots, driftwood, wattle and swab, sheep shank, cleat hitch and carrack bend, the cutting wind, choking roots and bags of sand, your cormorant grace, sea legs, divining rods, lost language, wet symbols, stars fished out of the sky, the hard shoulder, perfect shade of the storm, proof of address, confirmation names, dried up words funneled into bottles, what was hidden, sewn into coats, decades of the rosary, knots of Daberloch, the line in the road, the times we touched, armfuls of yellow gorse reflecting your face lowered into the dark, the residue, the constant moon, fluent wings of the deserting creatures I envied, memories certain and not so, each drop in the water a small cherished christening, the stones from my pocket, even the hags with their perfect holes, each one a turning point, even the one with your name on it, finally my own hands, what I was left with and what I was trying to get at. Thank you so much.